The doors opened, but the world behind them stayed closed. She waited, not for the first time, but this time was different. The silence in the air wasn't just an absence of sound, it was the weight of history, of injustice. How many times had she been told she didn't belong? How many more times would the world turn its back? This moment, though small, is part of a much larger story. A story of countless others who face the same cruel reality. But what happens when silence no longer suffices? What did they do to change the system of racial discrimination? When the world denies you, what happens when you stand your ground? Change doesn't start with a law. It starts with a question: why? As Jane walked away from the store, the weight of years of discrimination pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had faced rejection before. This wasn't new. But today, something in her stirred. The city around her hummed with life, but for Jane, it was a world of invisible walls, separating her from opportunities, from dignity. "Why does this always happen to us?" she whispered under her breath, the frustration in her voice barely audible. She passed a group of older men sitting on a bench, their faces a mix of tiredness and understanding. One of them, an elderly man named Charles, nodded knowingly. "It's been like this for decades, kid," Charles said, his voice thick with years of unspoken pain. "But silence won't change a thing. You have to speak, you have to stand up." His words struck Jane like a bolt of lightning. She turned to face him, eyes wide. "But what can we do? They never listen." "They'll listen when we make them," Charles replied, his voice quiet but firm. "It's time for us to stop accepting it." The words hung in the air, and Jane knew this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's. The system was built to keep them silent, but now they would speak together. Jane's feet carried her through the bustling streets, but her mind was somewhere else, still caught in the storm of emotions from the incident at the store. As she turned the corner, she spotted a group of protesters standing near City Hall, holding signs that read, "Equal rights for all," and "Stop the injustice." The signs weren't new to her. She'd seen them many times before. But today they seemed different. She felt a stirring deep inside, something that urged her to act. "Come on, Jane," she muttered to herself. "What are you waiting for?" Her hands tightened around the strap of her purse as she approached the group. The leader, a woman in her early 30s named Sarah, caught her eye. Sarah had been leading peaceful marches through the city for months, gathering more supporters with each passing week. Jane had seen her at rallies before, but always from a distance. Sarah stepped toward Jane as she approached. "You've been watching for a while," Sarah said, her voice kind but firm. "It's time to step in. We can't fight this alone." Jane looked at her, unsure. "But it's dangerous. What if they arrest us?" "They will," Sarah replied, without hesitation. "And they'll try to intimidate us. But we can't let fear stop us. We've been afraid for too long. You've been afraid for too long." A chill ran down Jane's spine as the words sank in. She knew Sarah was right. It wasn't just the store incident anymore. It was bigger than that. It was the silent oppression that had shaped her entire life, the quiet injustice that had been allowed to fester for too long. And now, standing there with Sarah, it felt like the right time to finally take a stand. But then, the sound of sirens in the distance interrupted her thoughts. Jane turned her head. A squad car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the group. The protesters began to tighten their ranks, but Jane felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had seen this before. The moment of truth was approaching. Would they back down? Would they be intimidated? Or would they push forward? "Stay calm," Sarah whispered, catching Jane's eye again. "This is just the beginning." Before Jane could respond, the officers approached. One of them, a tall man with a hard expression, spoke sharply. "This is an illegal assembly. Disperse immediately or face arrest." The tension in the air thickened. Jane felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. This was no longer a question of whether she would stand up. It was a question of whether she had the courage to face the consequences of standing up. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady and unwavering. "We will not be silenced. We are not afraid. We are fighting for our rights." The officer looked at her, then at the growing crowd of protesters. For a moment, there was silence. Jane held her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the officer's gaze shifted to Jane, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. Jane felt a jolt, a connection she hadn't expected. It was as if he could see the fear, the uncertainty in her eyes, but also the determination that was slowly growing inside her. He exhaled, his face hardening again. "You've been warned. Move, or we'll take action." But Jane didn't move. Neither did Sarah. Neither did anyone else in the crowd. The tension was palpable, and in that silence, Jane realized something. This wasn't just about one moment. This was the start of something bigger, something that couldn't be undone. The officer raised his hand, signaling the other officers to move in. Jane's heart raced, but she stood firm. This was her moment, and there was no turning back. The air around Jane felt thick with tension as the officer's hand moved to his belt, signaling his colleagues to advance. She could feel the heat of the crowd, the beating hearts of every person around her. Their eyes were on her. She had never felt so exposed, yet so alive. Sarah's voice cut through the silence, steady and commanding. "We stand here together. We stand for justice, for dignity. This isn't just a protest, it's our right to be heard." Jane's breath caught in her throat as she looked around at the faces of the protesters. Some were older, like Charles, others were younger, but they all shared the same fire in their eyes. This was a moment they had been waiting for, and Jane knew that it was her moment too. As the officer took another step forward, the crowd grew more agitated, murmurs rising. Jane felt the ground beneath her feet shifting, the weight of years of inequality pressing against her chest. She looked at the officer, and for a split second, their eyes locked again. This time it was different. There was no hardness in his gaze now, no anger. Just a deep, unspoken understanding. It was as if he too knew that this was more than just a protest. It was the beginning of a change that could not be stopped. "Step back," the officer barked, his voice now full of frustration. "You have no right to be here." But Sarah stepped forward, her posture unwavering. "We have every right to be here. We will not be silenced." The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. He took another step toward Sarah, but before he could speak again, a new voice rang out. "Let them be." It was Charles, the older man from the bench. His voice, though aged, had a quiet authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. The crowd fell silent, turning to him. Charles walked slowly to the front of the group, his eyes fixed on the officer. "You've arrested our young people, beaten our brothers and sisters, threatened us with your guns. And for what? To uphold a system of hatred? To keep us in the shadows? I've lived through this for decades, but I'll be damned if I let it keep going like this." He was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of the truth he spoke. Jane's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Charles stand before the officer. He was old, his skin wrinkled, his body frail, but his spirit was indomitable. The officer looked at Charles, then at the crowd, and for a moment, there was silence. The intensity of the moment seemed to stretch on forever. Jane could feel her hands trembling, her knees threatening to give way. But she didn't move. Neither did Sarah. Neither did anyone else. In that moment, it wasn't just Charles speaking. It was every person who had ever suffered from the weight of discrimination. It was every silent voice that had been crushed under the heel of an unjust system. The officer took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You think this will change anything?" he sneered. "We don't think. We know," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. With that, the officer signaled to his colleagues. The tension in the air was unbearable. Jane's breath came in ragged gasps as she waited for the inevitable. The police officers took a few steps forward, their hands resting on their batons, and Jane's heart skipped a beat. But then, something unexpected happened. The officer in charge looked around at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the group. And in that moment, Jane saw something shift in him, a brief flicker of doubt. It was as if the weight of their collective presence, the unyielding strength in their unity, had finally reached him. He hesitated. "Move them out," he said, his voice softer, less certain. His colleagues moved toward the crowd, but the officer himself stayed behind, staring at the protesters, at Charles, at Sarah, at Jane. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Jane's pulse raced. This was it. This was the breaking point. If they could make it through this moment, if they could stand together, they would win. The officer's hesitation stretched on for a few moments, but to Jane, it felt like a lifetime. She stood there, unsure, her heart pounding. Sarah's voice broke the tension. "We've waited long enough," she said, stepping forward. "We've suffered long enough, but we won't suffer in silence anymore." Her words echoed in the quiet, shaking Jane from her thoughts. Charles, his voice filled with quiet authority, added, "I've been fighting this fight all my life, but today is different. Today we make them hear us." His voice was steady, though the years had worn on him, and Jane could see that his strength wasn't in his body, but in his conviction. Then, without warning, Sarah continued, "This isn't just a protest, this is our right to be heard." The crowd, which had been tense and anxious, now stood taller. Jane felt the weight of their shared resolve. For the first time, she wasn't just a bystander. She was a part of something larger, something that had the power to make change. But the tension wasn't over. The officer stood there, glaring at them, as if waiting for them to break. Jane's eyes met his, and in that brief moment, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Could it be? Was he questioning the system he had long defended? "I can't do this anymore," the officer muttered, almost to himself. "What are we doing here?" Charles stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've arrested our young people, beaten our brothers and sisters, and for what? To uphold a system that's wrong. We've been patient, but that patience is running out." The officer looked down, visibly conflicted. The crowd waited in silence. Charles's words hung in the air, and Jane knew that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just about standing up anymore. It was about showing them that they were no longer afraid. The officer lowered his head, clearly torn. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered, as if confessing. "You're right. I see it now." Jane couldn't believe it. The officer, the very symbol of authority that had once stood against them, was now seeing the truth. "This isn't over," Sarah said, her voice full of quiet resolve. "But this is a start. We've made them listen." And with that, Jane felt a surge of hope she hadn't expected. The change, though small, was real. The fight wasn't over, but something had begun to shift. The power to change the system, to demand equality, was finally in their hands. The air was still charged with an electric tension, but for the first time, there was a sense of something shifting. As the officer walked away, his words still echoing in Jane's mind, she could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't over, far from it, but something fundamental had changed. The crowd, which had once stood in fear, now stood in strength. There was no turning back. Sarah turned to face Jane, her expression softer than it had been all day. "You see," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride, "it's not about the law. It's about the will to change things. They can't ignore us forever." Jane nodded, feeling the truth of Sarah's words settle deep inside her. She wasn't just part of the crowd now. She was part of something bigger, something that could not be silenced. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. The power of unity, of standing together, knowing that their collective voice could no longer be denied. "We've made them listen," Charles said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He had seen too many years of struggle, too many defeats, but today was different. "But this is just the beginning. We keep going. We keep fighting until we're heard." The crowd began to disperse slowly, but there was no sense of defeat, no sense of resignation. Instead, there was a quiet but determined energy. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Yet for the first time in Jane's life, she felt like the world was finally starting to see them. To see her. As she watched the group of protesters scatter, some of them heading to their homes, others talking in small groups, Jane felt a sense of relief wash over her. But it was mixed with something more powerful, hope. She had never believed that hope could feel so tangible, but standing there, knowing they had made a difference, she felt it more deeply than ever before. "Do you think they'll keep their word?" Jane asked Sarah, her voice soft but full of curiosity. "Do you think the police will really change?" Sarah met her gaze, her eyes full of unwavering certainty. "It's not about them, Jane. It's about us. We've planted a seed today. Now we water it and we let it grow." Jane smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had always been afraid of what might happen if they stood up, but now, standing in the midst of change, she realized that it was worth the risk. This was the beginning, and no matter what came next, they had started something that could never be undone. As the crowd began to thin and the day's events settled into memory, Jane walked quietly beside Sarah and Charles, her mind swirling with thoughts. The weight of everything that had just happened, the fear, the courage, the raw emotion, felt both overwhelming and liberating. She had stepped into the unknown, and now, she could feel the world changing beneath her feet. "Do you think they'll really listen?" Jane asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer than usual, tinged with doubt, yet there was an underlying strength that hadn't been there before. "Do you think this was enough to make a real difference?" Sarah looked over at her, her eyes steady but filled with a quiet understanding. "It's never about one moment, Jane. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen just because we've spoken up once. But what we did today, that was the start. They heard us. That's more than we could say before." Jane nodded slowly, taking in Sarah's words. She had always believed that change was something distant, something that could only be achieved by people much braver than herself. But today, she realized that change was something everyone had the power to spark, even in the smallest ways. It wasn't just about marching or protesting. It was about refusing to stay silent any longer. Charles, walking a little ahead of them, turned back with a look of quiet reflection on his face. We've seen a lot of battles, all of us. Some we won, some we lost. But what matters is that we keep going. We don't stop. We don't let them forget who we are. Jane looked at him, the lines of his face etched with years of hardship. He was right, of course. She could feel the resolve in him, the belief that no matter how many times they were pushed down, they would rise again. She wasn't sure she had always felt that way before, but now, standing alongside these two, she felt as though she was finally part of something that could change the world. The city around them was quiet now, the evening settling in. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, leaving the sky tinged with orange and purple. For a moment, Jane just stood there, looking up at the sky, her heart heavy with a mix of hope and sorrow. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more protests, more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, she believed that they could do it, that they would do it. "We keep going," Jane said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "We keep going until it's done." Sarah smiled, a soft but proud smile. "That's right." And as they walked away, Jane felt something shift within her, a quiet sense of determination, like the first light of dawn after a long night. It wasn't just about fighting for herself anymore. It was about fighting for all those who had been silenced, for all those who had been told their voices didn't matter. It was about making sure they would never be ignored again. In that moment, Jane knew that the fight wasn't over. But she was ready, and she was not alone. As the evening stretched on, Jane stood quietly, gazing out over the city. The quiet hum of the world around her seemed so distant now, as if the noise of everyday life had faded into the background. She turned to Sarah and Charles, the people who had become her allies in this fight. "Today was just the beginning," Jane said, her voice filled with determination. "But we can't stop here. We've started something, and now we need to see it through." Sarah nodded, her face resolute. "Exactly. It's easy to get discouraged, but we've taken the first step. Now we take the next. We keep showing up, speaking out. The more of us there are, the harder it will be to ignore us." Charles, who had always been the quiet strength of their group, spoke up, his voice low but firm. "They've seen us. They've heard us. But they won't stop trying to push us down. We keep pushing back, because that's how change happens." Jane took a deep breath, the weight of the words sinking in. She wasn't just part of a movement anymore. She was a force within it. They all were. And together, they had the power to make the world listen. "So let's keep going," she said, her voice steady. "Let's make them hear us. We won't stop until we've made the change we all deserve." With that, they walked on, ready for the next step. The story of Jane, Sarah, and Charles is a powerful reminder that change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with courage, unity, and an unwavering belief in what is right. It teaches us that even in the face of fear, standing up for what we believe in, no matter how small the step, can create ripples that eventually turn into waves of transformation. Jane's journey from doubt to determination reflects a truth that many of us can relate to. When we feel powerless, it often takes the strength of others to show us the way. Sarah's words, "We keep going," echo the heart of the story. Change is not just about a single protest or a single victory. It's about persistence and resilience. Charles, with his years of experience, reminds us that true progress requires constant effort, even in the face of setbacks. The fight is never over, but every action, no matter how small, brings us closer to justice. As we reflect on Jane's growth throughout this journey, it's clear that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter our age or background. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the world's problems, but as this story shows, the real change starts within us. We must stand up, speak out, and keep pushing forward, not just for ourselves, but for those who've been silenced for too long. The battle may be long, but as long as we keep showing up, change is inevitable. After watching Jane, Sarah, and Charles stand up against the system of racial discrimination, what do you think is the most important step we can all take to create lasting change in our communities? Is it speaking out, taking action, or simply listening and learning from each other? How can we all contribute, no matter how big or small the action may seem, to make sure that everyone's voice is heard and that equality becomes a reality for all? Share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.